talk about tomatoes a little bit now. Now these are indeterminate tomatoes. You have determinate, you have indeterminate. Indeterminate tomatoes, you can grow them as tall as you want. Now my wife prunes these, and she'll prune them to the top of the basket. Now when she prunes these, what she does is she takes this little growth right here out. Now if you left this, it would make this bushier. It's going to take away, and it will produce some tomatoes. But if you have a lot of tomatoes and you're trying to get some height and such as that to get your tomato plant bigger, you would prune them. Now determinate, normally you don't prune it. You'll prune off the bottom limbs close to the ground so you don't get water splash up, and part of that might be why these tomatoes have a problem with the rust and stuff that's got to the leaves. Part of it's because they just got too much water. But what I want to talk about is, now we always talk about, oh, we don't like the taste of greenhouse tomatoes. They pick them whenever they're close to ripe, and then they use certain method to ripen them up and everything off the plant. But you worry about birds and stuff coming out here and pecking your tomato plants. Well, it's easy enough to prevent the birds. All you've got to do is go get your rubber snake, something that looks like snakes from your area, and don't think it has to be black. We use a lot of green ones because the birds will spot these in here and they won't come and mess around to get these tomatoes. It's always worked. It works the same way for fig trees and stuff like that if you just lay a snake up there every so often. So be aware of that. But if you're wanting a tall, big tomato, then you plant these. Now, back to determinants. Now, determinants are not normally as big a tomato as this. Determinate tomatoes are tomatoes that they harvest all at one time. They come on pretty much, they'll grow to a certain height, they'll put on their fruit, and then they'll ripen up all pretty close to the same time. Indeterminates produce fruit all year long. So, and as I say fruit, because tomatoes are a fruit. Now if you want pretty round tomatoes, of course you need to make sure you water them from the bottom. Now ours, with the overhead sprinkler system, we tend to get some that's not as pretty and round. Of course they taste the flavors just as good on them, but realize when you're planting, decide what you want to do, because if you're canning, unless you have a whole lot of indeterminate plants, you're not going to have a good supply to can all at one time. If you're wanting to can them, and that's what we've got over here planted, or some determinate, well, kind of semi-determinate. But what they'll do when they come up and they'll get up big enough before it gets too hot, they'll go ahead and set their fruit, and then we'll do some canning on tomatoes. So when you plant something, realize what you're going to do with it. If you're going to eat tomatoes, you want to eat them all that year long, just get you a plant like this. It'll keep producing. And if you want to put another basket, you want to make this grow up higher, you want to keep pinching these little pieces out of here so it'll go up, that's fine. But if you're going to use a cage or a trellis, some kind of trellis or a stick, make sure you keep them tied up, because whenever they start putting out these little suckers that's in here, this will actually grow into another top. So if you left them down here, they'd start coming out, and you'd have to make sure you kept it in your cage or tied it to the side of your cage. And we'll probably talk more about that in another video. Okay, what I'm going to talk about here are tomatoes. Now I'm trying a second crop of tomatoes, which I planted them a little bit earlier, but this year's kind of an experimental thing because next year I want to do a lot of juicing and such. This tomato here, which is it was probably a beefsteak, but I'm trying to see how good they do on the ground. Now, tomatoes, as most of you know, they'll root along vine, and tomatoes are naturally a vining plant. And what I'm doing here is letting them grow like most of the producers did around this area. They just planted them, they go out. Now what'll happen when the weight gets there high enough and this tomato gets against the ground, this limb is going to take root, so it's going to feed the rest of this too. Now this one was actually one I grew from a transplant. But if you look at these down here, and I flagged these so I can keep track of them. This pepper here, this tomato here is, this was put in by seed. I wanted to see how well they do. Now, I'm going to tell you by direct seed you can't do it. It's coming up. But this was about the size of that transplanted one. When I transplanted that first one, it was about this size. So you can see in the time period, that other one is considerably bigger and is already flowering. So if you can transplant, they take a whole lot better. When the sprinkler comes out, it might splash dirt up here, and this tomato doesn't get as good a photosynthesis with its leaves covered, so it comes on slower. But if you look down here, I've got flags here at each one of these, because when they come up little, it's kind of hard. Now some of these have done better. These were seed too, but they've actually come on a little bit better. Once they get to this size, they'll do pretty good. But one way of marking your plants, if you are planting them in a field, keep from worrying about weeding around them or running over them when you come in here with your tiller, is just get some of these little survey flags and stick them by the plants. Once they get up big enough that you can see them easy, you can pull these up and use them next year.